So the topic for this morning is 7 plants, 7 planets, and what I wanted to do is run through 7 relatively common botanical medicines and chart some of their correspondences and relationships to the 7 inner planets of astrology. And I've got an hour and a half, so I'm not going to be able to go into as much detail onto the plants as I usually like to, but my main goal here is to illustrate the principle of correspondence. And this is something that I'm very passionate about because as I initially got into studying astrology and herbalism, and specifically focusing on studying a lot of the local plants here in our Cascadia bioregion, I was faced with this obstacle of you can't look up Devil's Club in Culpeper or Oregon Grape or Black Cohosh, or right, many of our North American remedies aren't classified according to the astrological principles that we see very common throughout the Renaissance era. And that was at first kind of frustrating for me because I was like, oh, I want to know what this plant is corresponded to. But what it really did was force me to look at the bigger picture, right, and ask that question, well, how did the ancient physicians, how did they determine the plant-to-planet relationship, right? What were the factors that they observed in a plant that would denote a particular relationship to a planetary force? And so I'd like to share that framework with you here before I jump into the 7 planets. And this always really struck me. Like, I remember looking at the 2 words, like plant, planet, right? And like the etiology of those words is synonymous, right? That there's, even in the root of these words, there's a connection between the terrestrial world and the celestial world. And that really is what the whole art of astro-herbalism and medical alchemy is all about, bridging those 2 worlds together. And I think this is really important, the reintegration of medical astrology and alchemy, which I'm going to talk about in more detail tomorrow, into our Western herbal paradigm. I think I call it the metaphysical backbone of Western herbalism, right? And you think of most books on Western herbalism, right? They tend to jump kind of straight into talking about chemistry or herbal actions, or use this herb for that kind of mindset, right? And I think a lot of people that study Western herbalism kind of feel like there's something missing there, right? I think Matthew's books are probably some of the only ones that really start off talking about cosmology, right? You open most books about herbal medicine, on Ayurveda, right? They don't start off talking about healing and medicine. They're talking about the universe, right? They're talking about creation. They're talking about life, right? And how those life principles influence people and plants and healing. And what I found for myself is that alchemy and medical astrology really form this, I call it the metaphysical backbone, right? It gives us an understanding of how life functions, of how God or the Creator descends down into matter, how life is created. And then through that model, we understand our plants in a much deeper way, and we're able to understand people and the root causes of illness in a much deeper way. So I find this, for myself, this work is critically important, and I think the mystery traditions have been kind of mysteries for a very long time, and kind of kept, they've been kind of like underneath everything. And I really see now this resurgence in these Western metaphysical traditions being a critical part to reintegrate into our model of herbalism. So, plants and planets, right? I was always thinking about that connection, that pattern. What is the pattern of relationship between a plant and a planet? And the way I see it is that when we're looking at a relationship between an herbal medicine and a planetary force, we want that relationship to encompass the wholeness of the plant, right? That a plant may not necessarily be ruled by Mars just because it has thorns. A plant may not necessarily be ruled by the sun just because it has an orange flower, right? A plant may not be ruled by Jupiter just because it has an action on the liver, right? That we want our plant-to-planet relationships to encompass the wholeness of the plant, right? Because our goal is that our practice of herbalism is holistic, right? And that our understanding is holistic. And so I wanted to start off here just talking about kind of my general framework for how to determine that plant-to-planet relationship, right? And so the first aspect of this is observing the ecosystem in which the plant resides, right? Observing the habitat and the environment. The way I see it is that the environment in which the plant resides, oh hello, is that the ecosystem in which the plant resides is information, right? Everything about a plant is a language. There's this great quote from Stephen Buhner. He says, "You see, everything in the natural world is composed of language. It just doesn't always use words." Right? It just doesn't always use words. And this is what, in the Western tradition, we call the doctrine of signatures, right? Signs of nature. That word signature, right? It's like a sign of nature. And so I always say that the habitat in which a plant resides oftentimes resembles the habitat, the ecological the ecology of the human body that plant is beneficial for, right? Nettles grows in damp, stagnant type environments, and it treats damp, stagnant type tissues in the body, right? Horsetail grows along the flowing rivers, and it's a kidney urinary tract medicine, right? So first studying the environment that the plant likes to grow in the wild, right? The gardens obviously is a little bit of a different situation. So the natural environment of the plant, there's a lot of information about that plant just based on where it grows, right? So that's the first thing that I'm observing. Specifically the energetics, right? Looking at, okay, is this a hot, dry, damp, cold type habitat? Is it in the deep, dark part of the forest? Is it in the wide open field? Is it like the south side of the mountain in the sun? Does it grow on the north side in the shade, right? There's a lot of information there. Second is the morphology of the plant, right? So we want to look at the color, the shape, the texture, the whole pattern, the way the plant grows. Does it like to grow by itself? Does it like to grow in community? Does it, not like to be around other plants, right? There's a lot of information about that in regards to the plants too, right? Everything about the way it grows, right? It's a language, it's a communication. There's signatures there. And I think, I'm not gonna get up on my soapbox about the doctrine of signatures because that's a thing I like to talk about, but I think the doctrine of signatures is oftentimes kind of simplified a little too much, saying like, oh, the plant, it looks like the organ that it's good for. But there's planetary signatures too, right? That nettles doesn't necessarily look like the blood, but it sure looks like Mars, who rules the blood. Right? And so, studying the whole morphology of the plant is a very critical thing to consider when we're looking at planetary correspondences. Next, we see how the plant then interacts with the human organism, right? So the first point of interaction is taste, right? That when the plant enters the body, it's the first communication that the plant has is through the taste of the herbs. And of course, taste is a critical aspect for determining medicinal properties of plants. We can understand a lot about a plant just through the taste, right? The organ systems it works on, the energetics, the actions, right? Those are all critical aspects of taste. Now, according to Ayurveda, there are 6 primary tastes, right? Sweet, sour, pungent, salty, bitter, and astringent. So those 6 tastes are important to refine your palate to really understand that, right? I mean, Saturn is a classically astringent, drying, tonifying type action, right? Mars is hot and pungent and aromatic, right? So the moon is sweet and moistening, right? So we can learn a lot about planetary correspondence simply through the tastes. Third, we have herbal actions, right? And I won't get too deep on my rant on herbal actions, but I think a lot of what books say are herbal actions aren't really actions, right? A lot of it is what uses are. Most of those begin with the word anti, right? So here I'm talking about vitalist actions, right? What's the vitalist actions? Demulcent, diuretic, diaphoretic, expectorant, right? An herbal action should give you an indication of how the plant will adjust a physiological process. That's kind of how I like to think of an herbal action. Next we have affinities, organ affinities, very, very important for determining a correspondence. And that used to be the one thing that I was kind of thinking of, was like, oh, and I'll talk about mullein later, but for years I was always like, oh, mullein, why did all the alchemists say it's, and medical astrologers say it's ruled by Saturn? It's a lung herb, shouldn't it be ruled by Mercury? Right? It drove me crazy for a really long time because I didn't understand the essence of mullein, right? And so Saturn really encompasses the wholeness of mullein much better than Mercury does. So affinities, very, very important. What organ system? The way I think of affinities is you have individual organs, you have organ systems, right? So you have the bladder, the kidneys, those are organs, right? But then you have the whole urinary system, right? Some plants have more of an organ affinity, some will have more of a system affinity, right? And then you have tissues, right? Muscle, blood, mucous membranes, etc. So those are kind of the three layers of affinities that I think of. And then the all-important energetics, right? And by energetics, I'm not referring to like an esoteric kind of spiritual function. I'm talking about a very physiological aspect of the plants, which I think has been overlooked by a lot of herbalists, and I think it's critical. Like, to me, the energetics is so key because that's what enables you to differentiate when an herb is appropriate or inappropriate for a particular constitution. Right? It's like, okay, someone has a cough. Okay, so a lot of people think, okay, well, we'll look up expectorants, right? And then you get this huge 50 plant list of expectorants, and they're like, well, it's an expectorant, just give them one and it'll help, right? But it's like, and you'll see in that list licorice and marshmallow and L-campaign and osha and plantain and red clover and coltsfoot and all these herbs with like marshmallow and osha, totally different herbs, right? One's indicated for a dry, irritable cough. One's indicated for a heavy, damp, cold cough, right? So the energetics, very, very important. I tend to think of herbs in 7 energetic categories, right? So we have the classic humoral model of energetics of temperature and moisture, right? So you have hot and cold, wet and dry. But then another critical factor that we see from the physiomedicalist would be not just temperature and moisture, but tone. The tone of the tissue, very, very important. So then you have tonic action, right? And we tend to think of tonic as like, oh, it's got minerals and is nutritive and builds up the body, right? I think the word tonic is kind of this loose, kind of loose term in herbal medicine. From a physiomedicalist perspective, tonic, tone, right? It's increasing the tone of the tissue. So use it for like a lax, kind of lax type tissue. So you have tonic and relaxant, right? So you can either, I think of like I play music, right? So I think of like a guitar string, right? A tonic is gonna tighten that guitar string and a relaxant's gonna loosen that string, right? And then the third action there would be stimulant, right? So you have stimulant, relaxant, and tonic. And I believe it was Cook said, we really only do 3 things. We either stimulate, relax, or tonify. So those are kind of the 7 herb energetic categories. And you can see combinations of those, right? We have cooling stimulants, warming stimulants, cooling, relaxants, warming, relaxants, etc. Right? So, okay, so we have ecosystem, we have morphology, we have, and you kind of see we start from a big picture and are getting more and more specific. So you have the ecosystem, you have the you have the morphology, you have the taste, you have the action, you have the affinity, you have the energetics, right? These are all things that you have to consider about a plant when you're determining a relationship to a particular planet. And then lastly, I think of this concept, a great concept in classification of medicines from Ayurvedic medicine, they call Prabhava. Prabhava, P-R-A-B-H-A-V-A, and it means special potency, right? It's what is it about the plant that transcends classification, right? What is the uniqueness of that plant? What is it about that plant that goes beyond hot, cold, wet, dry, diuretic, diaphoretic, right? All those other things that we talked about. What's the uniqueness about that herb? Prabhava also indicates the esoteric properties of the plants, right? The psychological, emotional, and spiritual virtue of the plant, right? So what is it, how is that plant going to impact more the subtle body, right? And so that's a critical thing to consider, right? And this is what in alchemy they call the initiatic virtue of a plant. What is that plant's initiatic virtue? Meaning, how is that plant going to essentially initiate you into a higher level of consciousness, a higher level of self-awareness? And this is one of the primary areas of focus of alchemy, right? Is that alchemy is based on transformation. How are we going to transform our lives, right? And heal ourselves, transformational healing, right? And so much of the psycho-spiritual properties of plants can oftentimes be understood through its planetary relationship, right? And it's why I love this system is because it gives you, the planets give you a core pattern that reflects on the physical, psychological, emotional, and spiritual level. It weaves them all together, right? So it's like when you're looking at an herb like Devil's Club, which we'll talk about, right? Everything about Devil's Club is Mars, right, on a physical level. And when you understand that it's ruled by Mars, and then you look at its psycho-spiritual actions, it's totally Martian, right? Willpower and strength and kind of going into those dark places, the warrior kind of energy, right? It's all very, very Martian. And so this is why I find the planetary correspondences are really beneficial, because it helps you see patterns in the plants, right? And this is something I always had I had a really hard time learning about herbs when I first started studying herbs at Bastyr, right? It was like, okay, we're going to study the chemistry over here, and we're going to study the botany over there, and the anatomy and physiology of people over there, and it was like all this stuff, and I was like, I didn't know how to make sense of it, right? But then with the astrology, it was like, oh, it's like that's the golden thread that weaves it all together, right? That's the way I like to think of astrology. It's that golden thread that brings together all of these different aspects of a plant that are kind of seemingly disconnected, but in reality they're all very interconnected, right? Because they're all in the plant, right? The plant's what brings them together. And the planet gives us that different perspective, right? It's like you think of, you know, the earth and the sky, and when you take this astrological perspective, it's like you're up here and you see the bigger picture, right? It's like, I think of like the difference between like a mouse and a hawk. Right, it's like a mouse sees everything really up close and all the details, right? But the hawk sees kind of this bigger perspective and is able to see kind of the landscape from a different orientation. That's what the astrology really provides for our understanding of plants, right? It gives us a new perspective. And I don't know about you, but I always like new perspectives on things. So, does that make sense? Yeah, okay, great. Now, of course, there's other layers of correspondences that one can work with, but I find those are the critical pieces, right? That framework that I just laid out for you. And whenever you're working with a plant, studying a plant and wanting to begin to understand it astrologically, I feel like it's very important to do your research on that herb, right? And kind of put all that framework I just did, observe all of those things, study all those things, and kind of spread it out. And then you want to kind of take a step back and say, okay, of course you have to know your planets too, right? But then which planetary energy is going to relate to that wholeness of the plant, right? The wholeness of the plant. And I'm really passionate about this because a lot of the old herbals, Culpeper, or even other kind of more on the magical side, books that talk about planetary correspondences, they'll just give you lists, right? Here's all the Mars herbs and here's all the Saturn herbs, or even under individual plant listings, it'll say, you know, okay, planetary ruler, Venus. And then they'll talk about the herb, but they never really explain why, right? Why is that plant ruled by that planet? It's because for me, I don't want to just say, oh, okay, yep, that's what it is, and have to memorize it. I don't like, who likes memorizing, right? No one likes memorizing stuff, right? It's like, no, I want to understand the principle behind it, right? And for me, that's kind of the way that I've been working with it, and I find it's is pretty effective. So, okay, so It's kind of a long introduction. But so what I'd like to do here is run through just 7 relatively common plants and illustrate for you how those correspondences work. I also have some spagyric essences here of those remedies that I'd like to pass around. You're more than welcome to take a couple of drops on the hand and lick it off if you feel so called to. They're all mild, gentle, safe herbs, but if you don't want to taste them, that's fine. But these have all been prepared according to the astrological influences and rulership. So the spagyrics anchor that celestial force into the medicine through the way that they're prepared. So I just wanted, so you can have an experience of those remedies, and the spagyrics work physiologically as well as astrally. So I'm going to talk about the spagyrics in more detail tomorrow. So the first plant that I would like to talk about is ruled by the sun, and this would be St. John's wort. So I'll go ahead and we'll split it. So I'll send a bottle down each row there. And so St. John's wort, Hypericum perforatum. This is one of my favorite solar remedies. So first off, ecosystem, right? Where does St. John's wort like to grow? Right, the open fields. Right, I remember driving up through the mountains and there's like, no St. John's wort, no St. John's wort, and then you like round the bend to the south side of the mountain, full open sun, and it's like, oh, it's just like golden fields of glory of St. John's wort. So we see it really likes to grow in that open environment. It likes that direct sun. You'll never really see St. John's wort growing in the deep dark part of the forest, right? Morphologically, we see it have those bright yellow flowers. Right? It's a classic solar signature. Bright yellow flowers, and it kind of has those long stamens that kind of look like little beams kind of shooting out from the center there, right? It's a signature for light and for the sun. Of course, the Latin name perforatum indicates the small perforations in the leaves that when you hold it up to the light gets through. Right, the light gets through. Now, it's a signature for a lot of aspects of the medicine. It's a very unique aspect of St. John's wort. First off, it's a signature for puncture wounds. It's one of our best topical puncture wound medicines, but it's also a signature for astral punctures, the way I like to think of it, right? Leaky astral body, like people with unclear boundaries, are very sensitive, and they tend to leak their vitality out, and it kind of lowers their vitality through I think of it as like astral leakage. Kind of a weird way of describing it, but so looking at the signatures there, and now we see the medicinal virtue of St. John's wort has a lot of dynamics to it. But first and foremost, like, what's the number one thing everyone says about St. John's wort, right? What's St. John's wort good for, right? Depression, right? Now, I tend to think of it more as good for melancholy, right? Not so much like severe, major depression, right? And depression's very complex, right? Very complex. Taking 3 drops of St. John's wort isn't going to take your depression away, right? It requires some like internal work, right? Some self-reflection, and sometimes people are depressed because of life circumstances that they just have to grieve, right? So I don't think of St. John's wort as this like, oh, magical thing, it's just going to take your depression away, right? But it can be very supportive, right? But we think of depression, like, how do you feel when you're depressed, right? Down, in, tired, heavy, lethargic, melancholy, right? That's all qualities of the melancholic humor, right? Melancholy. And so we see that melancholy humor is kind of similar to what the physiomedicalists would call like a cold depression tissue state, right? When the tissues are depressed and low in function, there's a coldness in the body. We see St. John's wort warming. It's a warming remedy. It's a liver stimulant, which a lot of people forget that this is a major liver remedy, right? I mean, it acts on this whole metabolic detoxification process in the liver they call cytochrome P450, right? And that's why it doesn't play very nicely with a lot of drugs and things like that. You got to be very careful when you administer St. John's wort to someone, right? But it's acting on this whole liver detoxification, and that we see a lot of yellow remedies as a signature for the liver, bile. Also Manipura chakra, the third chakra, is that yellow color which relates to liver and gallbladder. We see yellow, dandelion and greater celandine, Oregon grape, golden seal. They all have that similar color signature there. But the way I think of St. John's wort really is that it's like a stimulant, right? And it's critical to, when I say stimulant, everyone's like, oh, like coffee? No, it's not. Like, coffee's a nervous system stimulant, right? But we have all types of different stimulants, right? We have digestive stimulants, we have respiratory stimulants, we have circulatory stimulants, we have hepatic stimulants, kidney stimulants, right? All different types of stimulants. But the way I think of St. John's wort is that it really is operating through the nervous system, right? When the nervous system kind of has that depressed function, the nerves, I think of like the nerves aren't awake, they're not alive. And so the way I see St. John's wort working is really through the nerves, kind of bringing the nerves back to life in a sense. And that's an aspect of the depressed tissue state, is the tissue is lacking function, right? It's just like depression, right? It's like kind of down and in. So St. John's wort as a solar remedy uplifts the spirit. It uplifts the spirit, right? And I tend to think of it like from a Chinese perspective as almost like a Shen remedy, a Shen tonic, where it kind of uplifts you and shines that light down, right? And especially when people are kind of in that dark place, I think of St. John's wort as that light that shines down into the subconscious mind, into the kind of maybe the lower part of the self, to understand the self on a deeper level, right, and to transmute that in a good way. It's also a great protection medicine too. We see that used very. Judith was mentioning etiology of disease in the Renaissance is, hexes and witchcraft and things like that. St. John's wort is this classic remedy used in that regard. So those are just some of the qualities that I see being associated with St. John's wort. I'm sure there's lots more, but these are just the ones that are coming to me off the top of my head here. So, let's see here. So let's shift gears into talking about the moon. And we'll pass around some mugwort here. Really excited about this mugwort essence. It's a newer one for us. This is the Artemisia that grows kind of down in my area, the Artemisia douglasii. So we see, first and foremost, the moon. I guess I'll cover some of the general correspondences of the planet too, so you understand that a little bit more. So primary parts of the body, the moon rules, be the breasts, the stomach, the mucosal membranes, as well as the brain and aspect of the nervous system. And the moon obviously is very damp, right? So it's that moistening quality to the body. We see a lot of our demulcent remedies are ruled by the moon. It's like slippery elm, marshmallow, and things like that. I don't consider mugwort a demulcent remedy by any means, but certainly we see, I'll talk about the actions in a minute. So the Artemisias all generally like to grow in damp habitats, right? Down where we live, it's always growing by the water, right? It's always growing along the rivers and areas where there's moisture accumulation, which we've been in a big drought down there for the last number of years, and so it's always kind of an indication, right, where the water is, or at least where it used to be. So morphologically, the whole Artemisia genus is, in my opinion, one of the coolest reflections of a morphological correspondence to a planet, right? Like, what's the color of the Artemisias, right? The silvery blue color, right? It looks like moonlight, right? When you look at it, it's got that kind of soft green, almost bluish, silvery color to it, which is very reminiscent of the moon. Now, of course, Artemisia is the genus of mugwort and also wormwood and sweet annie and sagebrush and a handful of other remedies. But Artemisia, the root of that, right? Artemis is the goddess of the moon. So we see even in the Latin binomial a correspondence to the planet. Now, I tend to think of the whole Artemisia genus as being a very great genus of plants that treats stagnation in the tissues, right? Dampness, damp accumulation, stagnation in the tissues. We see that it has, most of them are what we would call an aromatic bitter, right? An aromatic bitter, I think it's David Winston refers to them as fragrant bitters, right? And this is a really cool combination of taste and action, because, and it's very useful because what we see is bitters, for the most part, plants that have a very true bitter taste tend to be very cooling, very drying, very draining to the tissues energetically, right? And I think this is something that oftentimes a lot of people overlook, right? That, we think, oh, I need to detox, and so I'm going to take all these bitter alternatives or something, right? But they're doing it maybe in the middle of the winter, and maybe they have kind of a cold constitution that can, not be very ideal. But these fragrant bitters are very beneficial because you see the combination of a bitter taste combined with warming aromatic essential oils, right? Warming aromatic essential oils. So you see these remedies are not nearly as cooling as a true bitter like dandelion or Oregon grape or gentian root or something like that, right? So, so fragrant bitters. So all of the bitters are going to have a liver gallbladder affinity affecting the stomach and the intestinal tract through stimulating digestion, right? Through stimulating digestion. And we see, of course, the mugwort, excellent bitter tonic, stimulating digestion, secretions of the stomach, which of course the moon rules. Now we also see mugwort is used for the female reproductive system, right? And the moon rules the uterus and the womb, right? So another organ affinity there, the way that it relates to the uterus. And of course, what do we all think of mugwort for? Dreams, right? This is our classic dream plant in Western herbalism. Right? So it makes sense that it would be ruled by the moon, right? So we see you see how that pattern, the pattern in the plant, it's like where it grows and what it looks like and what it tastes like and the organs it works on in the body, even the tissues that it works on in the body, right? The moon generates damp conditions in the body, right? Mugwort grows in these damp environments and treats dampness in the body, right? So, and then its whole Prabhava, right? Its special potency, that uniqueness, that esoteric property of the mugwort, right? It really, the way I see it is that it transitions you from waking consciousness to dreaming consciousness, or it transitions you from being awake to being asleep, but maintaining your alertness, right? So that transition from being awake to asleep, but you're able to maintain consciousness, right? So it kind of builds that bridge between waking life and dreaming life and allows you to stay awake while you fall asleep, right? Which is this paradox, right? But lucid dreaming, right? And this is a big part of alchemy, right? Is that big part of alchemy? This is lucid dreaming, being able to dream your works before you do them in the physical, right? So, so it's a little bit about Artemisia there. You see how the correspondences work? Does that make sense? How you can see the different layers of relationship and how the planet weaves it all together, right? It weaves it together. And are those making their way around? Yeah, the mugwort's quite lovely, isn't it? I also like to think about how in Chinese medicine, they use the artemisias as moxibustion. You all familiar with moxibustion, right? And it's right, moving stagnant energy from the meridians, right? Moving stagnant energy through the meridians, and we can think of, well, in an aspect of the alchemical tradition is the Kabbalah, the tree of life on the Kabbalah, and they say that the sphere of the moon they call Yesod, and Yesod is the sphere associated with the astral body, right? Which is, you have our physical body, and then just kind of like just outside of it is that subtle body, or the astral body. Paracelsus called the inner starry sky. And so I kind of like to think of how Mugwort is this lunar medicine, right, that has this affinity for the astral body, and it's kind of that warming, stimulating property that we see with the volatile oil, cleansing that stagnation through the meridians, through the points, etc., which is, right, the astral body, right? That's the way I think of. I have a friend that's an acupuncturist, and they're saying, I was talking about spagyrics and how they work on the physical side, but they also work on kind of this esoteric side, working through the energetics and such, and how they're prepared astrologically, and they're like, oh yeah, that's really interesting. They're like, yeah, I see acupuncture is kind of working the same way. It's like each point is like a star, right? And the way all those points connect are meridians. It's like a constellation, and there's 12 meridians. 12 constellations in the Western zodiac, right? So I think it's very interesting, and Matthew has some great charts that correspond the 12 organ systems of Chinese medicine to the 12 signs of the zodiac in Western medical astrology, and it lines up very, very nicely. So, okay, so next remedy here in Planet, one of my personal favorites. So, one of our local chief medicines, the way I think of it, would be Oplopenax horridus, Devil's Club. Y'all familiar with Devil's Club? So, for those of y'all living here in the Northwest, it's a good plant to meet. Even to just gaze upon it is very humbling. Beautiful, beautiful plant. This is one of my favorite plants. A lot of people that work with it tend to end up saying the same thing. Of course, I say that before I talk about any plant. I'm like, oh, this one's my favorite. So, okay, so Mars. Mars is that planet of energy, right? It's the masculine force. It represents our power, our will. I see Mars as kind of being like right here in the solar plexus, like being strong in yourself, being in your power and your strength and protection, right? It's why it relates to our immune system, right? It's what protects the body. It's also our blood, the way the blood flows. And the adrenal glands, right? That fight or flight response, right? Very much so a Martian response. Fevers and such also ruled by Mars. Mars is the hottest of the planets, and this is considered in medical astrology the lesser malefic, right? Meaning that it's one of the, well, in the old days they would say it's one of the bad guys, right? But I don't see any planet as being inherently good or bad, right? It just is, and it has to do with how well we're able to work with it and integrate it, right? So, but Mars is considered one of the planets that can cause a lot of issues with people, and Mars is going to primarily generate diseases associated with heat. It is the hottest of the planets. I tend to think of the sun as warm, right? Mars is hot. And I think a really good, just side note, a really great botanical reflection of that is the difference between ginger and cayenne. Right? If you think of ginger as like this, think of the color of a ginger root, right? It's like that golden solar color, right? And it's gently warming. Now, dried ginger is a lot hotter than fresh ginger, so I'm kind of thinking of fresh ginger, but the fresh ginger, right? It's just like gently warming to the system. But cayenne is like pow, like hot, right? And you think, Mars is the red planet, and you think of that color of cayenne pepper, right? It's that bright red color there. So, but anyways, back to Devil's Club. So, little digression. So with the Devil's Club, we see that morphologically, it really embodies a lot of Martian signatures. Primarily, the whole plant is covered in these prickles, right, or spikes. The stems and the leaves are all covered with this sharpness, right? That sharpness, and Mars tends to rule like weapons and intensity and blood and kind of things that sting and are sharp and inflammatory and things like that. So, and it's interesting that the spikes on Devil's Club actually carry Staphylococcus bacteria. So if you get a bad enough Devil's Club scratch, you can actually get a staph infection from it. And interestingly enough, it's been very well researched, especially in Japan, but that's one of our primary staph remedies, right, for staph infections. You can use it topically as a wash, but also internally. So it's kind of one of those sympathy, antipathy dynamics there, right, where the plant contains the illness that it treats, or one of them that it treats. So we see that sharpness, that prickliness, but also that Devil's Club claims its place in the forest, right? It has a very clearly defined boundary, right? And it's kind of has its dominion, its territory. And it grows really, really tall. I mean, it's got quite the presence. I've seen Devil's Club growing like 15 feet tall, right? These big leaves and very, very powerful plant. I mean, when you see that plant, it's humbling, right? For those of you that have seen it, you know what I'm talking about, right? It's humbling as it has such a strong presence. And so we see some of the signatures there in the morphology. Now, the taste of it, it's quite a pungent, warming plant. And what I found is that, you know, different people will sometimes recommend harvesting it in the fall, some harvest in the spring. I've actually found slightly different qualities in spring versus fall harvested root bark. I find the spring root bark is a little bit warmer, whereas the fall root bark is a little bit sweeter, not quite as hot and pungent, which to me it seems, you know, to me kind of reflects the season, right? That in the autumn it's a little bit more damp, whereas in the spring it's a little bit more warm. But it has that pungent, warming taste. You take a strong Devil's Club, but most people tend to feel it right there, right in their solar plexus. So as far as its properties, its medicinal virtues, there's all sorts of things that this plant does. But first and foremost, one of the primary ways that I tend to think of this remedy is as a chi tonic, or as a revitalization medicine. In Ayurveda, I would imagine they would probably categorize it as a rasayana, a rejuvenative tonic. So it builds up the vital reserve, right? It builds up the vital reserve, specifically like the solar plexus. People are tired, cold, weak, deficient, and especially people like don't have very clear boundaries, like they're kind of weak but really sensitive. And I'm not saying like weak physically, but they just feel like tired and kind of deficient, right? Deficient in their energy. And so it kind of builds up that strength, but then clarifies that boundary. So we see a lot of times people that are very empathetic, very, very sensitive, maybe don't have a strong sense of self, don't have a strong sense of their willpower, right? They maybe have like a hard time getting out of bed in the morning, or they're really tired and they can't like get their will, they don't have that drive, right? That energy. So I don't think of it necessarily like stimulating like coffee, right? That kind of like takes your energy from your core and disperses it out and is draining, right? But it's more kind of that replenishment on more of a core vital level. Does that make sense? Right? It's more of replenishing the vital reserve, which is kind of like the paradox about stimulants, right? It's like they give you all this energy, but they're giving you that energy by pulling it out of your core, right? So in the long term, they tend to be more depleting and make you more tired. So that's one aspect of the Oplopanax that I see being very Mars related, right? In my opinion, it's one of the best medicines for protection. And we see coastal people here in the Pacific Northwest used it pretty extensively in that regard. Heard of people building whole huts out of it, like almost like a lodge out of the sticks, keeping the spines on, right? And they would sit in there for their protection, you know, to protect their prayer and to protect the work that they were doing. They would also burn it too in ash and mix it with bear grease and tattoo themselves with it. I actually know a guy that did that. He actually has Devil's Club tattoos. I was like, wow, man, you're a badass. Like, I got my own bear grease too. I'm like, wow, it's impressive. There's another aspect of that protection. Of course, its affinity for the immune system as well is indicative of a Martian quality. The warming quality. One of the main things that Devil's Club has been researched quite extensively, primarily the Oplopanax japonica. In Japan, it's a Japanese species.
What's the name?
Oplopanax japonica. Yeah, they've done a lot of research on it over there, but there's also been some research done on it in this regard in the West, though, is in the treatment of type 2 diabetes, in the way that it resensitizes the cells to insulin, right? So in type 2 diabetes, it's like you have your cells, and in normal physiological function, the insulin binds, the cell opens, blood sugar enters the cell to be utilized in metabolism, and everything's hunky-dory, right? But with insulin resistance, the insulin binds, and something in the post-binding effect doesn't, like it's malfunctioned, and so the door doesn't open, so blood sugar levels stay high. The pancreas is like, whoa, blood sugars are high. We need to secrete more insulin, right? And so there's all this insulin flooding the body, and the blood sugar stays high. And of course, that has a very damaging effect on the body, right? If you think of, you know, your blood should be like a watery consistency, but when your blood sugar is high, it's like syrup, right? And so it congests and sticks within the capillary beds and the tissues and provokes inflammation and things like that. So what will we see with the Oplopanax is that it resensitizes the cell so that when the insulin binds to the cell, that post-binding effect happens and the channel opens. So this is a very interesting signature, right? Almost like a biochemical signature, right? Of antipathy, right? Venus rules insulin and sugar and sweetness, right? And Mars is the opposite quality to Venus, right? So here we see Devil's Club being used to treat a Mars plant being used to treat a Venus disease, right? Diabetes would be like a Venus disease. So that would be an antipathetic quality property of the Devil's Club there. The way it's used in the supportive treatment for type 2 diabetes. Of course, there is no cure for type 2 diabetes apart from changing your diet and lifestyle. So in that regard, it is totally reversible, and we can support people with herbs, but I think it's a little unreasonable to expect a plant to cure a disease caused by a dietary factor, which as Judith was mentioning, in the Renaissance era, they had 5 etiologies of disease. They called 5 entias. That would be the entia or ens toxicali, the entia of poison, which isn't just like mercury or pesticides or things like that, but it can also be the metabolic waste products, right? Metabolic byproducts, or eating too much refined sugar, right? So that's a little bit on the Devil's Club there, just some of the things that are coming off the top of my head. It does move the blood a little bit too, which is an aspect of it that I like as well. Also a Martian quality. I'm curious as to whether it has diaphoretic properties. I don't know if anyone's used it as a diaphoretic, but a part of me does feel like it kind of has a little bit of a almost diffusive, like opening up capillary beds or something. It's nothing I've read about, but it's something that I feel and notice when I take it.
I've only seen Devil's Club along the river. Where do you see it?
Yeah, deep dark parts of the forest. Kind of a very Scorpio environment, right? Cold, damp, fixed water, right? And it's a very Scorpio-like plant, right? It's, I really see it as, so for me, like I work with the planetary correspondence, but I also like to work with an elemental correspondence of the plant, as well as a modal or dosha type correspondence with the plant. And I'm going to talk about the threefold pattern tomorrow when I talk about salts in herbs. But So for me, I think of Devil's Club as being like the Mars, being the planetary ruler, and then that water element, right? Because it treats that dampness in the body, it grows in that damp habitat. And it kind of has, it's a very Scorpio plant, right? Because it's like Devil's Club, like it's like going into the dark parts of the self, right? The subconscious, and like facing your demons, essentially, is the way I tend to think of it. That underworld journey, right? To face the lower parts of the self, right? And it's a very Scorpio theme, right? That Scorpio is kind of like that underworld, right? Ruled by Pluto in our modern system, also ruled by Mars, which matches Devil's Club quite nicely. So, tastes pretty nice, hey? Yeah, nice and warming. So we can maybe balance it out here with some Venus. It's one of my favorite spagyrics going around there. It's the wild rose. Wild rose, of course. Venus is the planet of relationship and love and beauty and the arts, and physiologically Venus rules the kidneys as well as the veins, right? The venous system, right? Comes from the root of the word for our veins comes from Venus, right? So similarity there. Venus also rules the skin along with Saturn. And I find that Venus, so one of the qualities of Venus is that she's relaxed, right? She tends to be very relaxed. And so typically when we use the word relax, we tend to think of like chill, right? Like psychologically relaxed, right? But okay, so if you take that psychological quality and you put it in a tissue, right, that gives you a really good indication of a quality of a tissue. And are you all familiar with Matthew's book, The Practice of Traditional Western Herbalism? It's a really critical book, I believe, for understanding the underlying states of the tissues, right? Like a lot of systems talk about constitutional theories, right? Well, tissue states is basically what's the constitution of a tissue. And one thing that I really like about the way he laid those 6 tissue states out is that there's the energetic quality, hot, cold, wet, dry, etc. But there's also like a second word that goes along to it. So it's not just cold, it's cold depression, right? And I find that second word there is always really important. It's always kind of like almost like a word we typically use for a psychological state, right? So I think of like what depression is, and then kind of put that quality like in someone's liver, or in the kidney, or in the digestive system. Right? You think of like another one I really like is heat excitation, right? Think of like a little kid Christmas Eve when they're all really excited and they're just like running around. They're like, oh my God, it's Christmas, I'm so excited. And they're like so active and dynamic and fired up, right? And so then you take that quality and you kind of put it in a tissue, and that gives you a good understanding of how our tissues express themselves energetically, right? So heat gives you one bit of information, but once you plug the excitation side of that tissue state, it kind of makes you see it differently. And I've been thinking about that a lot. So in regards to Venus, right, that tissue state that I see relating to Venus is what it calls damp relaxation, right, or the lax tissue state. And so it's associated with the water element, and the water element we see in those tissue states kind of manifests in 2 different ways. So you have water stagnating and congesting and congealing, creating toxicity in the tissues, right? Like the river is flowing and then the water slows and it turns into a swamp, right? So again, ecological, I think one of the critical factors of holistic herbalism is changing from seeing the body as a machine to seeing the body as an ecosystem, right? Seeing the body as an ecosystem. And to me, these tissue states have really helped me to be able to perceive that more readily in people. So you have water stagnating, but then you have water like overflowing, right? Water flowing. And so the damp relaxation tissue state is more that fluids are leaking out of the tissues. I think of it as like an earth deficiency. Like the structure and the tone of the tissues isn't tight, isn't toned, and it's leaky. So they get kind of like loose and flabby and weak and apathetic, right? And then all of a sudden there's these gaps, and then the fluids are able to leak and pass through, like a runny nose. Like a runny nose is a classic example of lax tissues. You have these thin, clear, watery secretions just kind of pouring out of your body, right? The old doctors would call diarrhea like relaxed bowels, right? Fluids just passively leaving the body. And this tissue state is classically treated with astringents. And many of our Venusian plants are astringent, right? So we see that with things like horse chestnut and with this rose. So I'm finally getting around to it here. Yeah.
Leaky gut syndrome?
Absolutely, yeah, leaky gut syndrome I definitely think of as a lax tissue state. Among others, there's usually other states that go along with it, but yeah, absolutely. And that's where...
Latin name for wild rose?
Rosa nutkana.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Yes, and this is where we see in the treatment of leaky gut syndrome, many of our vulneraries, topical plants that you typically think of as using for treating skin wounds, right? Two primary ones I think of, calendula and plantain, right, are taken internally to heal the wound in the gut, because the gut's like our inner skin, right? So we tend to think of like, oh right, plantain, it's like this topical, or calendula, you know, use it topically for a cut or something like that. But a leaky gut is kind of like a cut in your digestive system, and that's really like technically not considered inside the body. It's still like technically it's outside the body. So a lot of our topical vulnerary medicines you can take internally to heal the lining of the gut. And so I use calendula and plantain for that a lot. I think leaky gut syndrome is a critical thing going on right now because of antibiotic trauma and all the whole the whole food thing and all sorts of stuff. So back to rose. We see that the rose is one of the universal symbols of beauty and love, right? It's like you think of what would be the number one plant representative of love in the heart, right? Most people go to the rose. And that alone is a pretty strong correspondence for Venus. And you think of courting and things like that, and it's always like the rose, bringing a bouquet of roses, right? It's like nourishing and feeding that love. And you see too the flower petals, like the flowers of the rose. If you touch them, they have that really soft, velvety feeling to it, right? Smoothness, like Venus plants tend to be like really beautiful and like lush and kind of feathery, and they're like those plants that just kind of like wow, like it's so pretty, And so but I really think of that texture, like that velvety texture. You guys know what I'm talking about, that velvety feeling, right? That to me is a very Venusian